Chapter 9 of Rebellion by Joseph M. Patterson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Georgia and Mason did not overpass the outward signs and boundaries of Platonism, learning to avoid not merely evil, but the appearance of evil. When they met in the 100-eyed office, they were casual. During the autumn, they took long walks together every Sunday. There had been a dry spell that year, lasting with hardly a break from the forepart of June, which baked the land and sucked out the wells and put the northern woods in danger of their lives. The broad corn leaves withered yellow and the husbandmen of the great valley protested that the ears were but "lil nubbins, with 3 inches of nothin' at the tips, taperin' down to a point, and where'll we get our seed next spring?" When the huge downpour came at last, and by its miracle saved the crop which had been given up for lost a fortnight since, Mason cursed the day, for it fell on the first day of the week and cost him, item, 1 walk and talk with Georgia Connor. She stood so near his eyes as to hide from his sight a billion bushels parching in the valley, though he was country bred. To her their Sundays together brought not a joy as definite as his, but rather a sense of contentment, of relief from the precision of the other days of her week. It pleased her to wander to the big aviary and look at the condors and cockatoos and wonder about South America, where they came from; then to stroll slowly over to the animals and have a vague difference of opinion with him about whether a lion could whip a tiger. She thought so, because the lion was the king of beasts, but Mason didn't, because he'd read of a fight where it had been tried. Once he even grew a trifle heated because she wouldn't listen to reason and fact and stuck to the lion, because he'd been called the king of beasts, whereas all naturalists knew the elephant and the gorilla and the rhinoceros. There she interrupted him with a laugh, and called him a boy and too literal. Every Sunday they had this same dispute until finally they both learned to laugh about it and make it a joke between them, and she told him he was doing much better. They walked by the inside lake and wondered if the wild ducks and geese on the wooded isle liked to have to stay there, and they took lunch when they got good and ready, perhaps not until 2 or 3 or even 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She always went home for supper, but often she came out again afterwards and took the car downtown to a Sunday evening ethical society which foregathered in an old-fashioned theater building. There was almost always some well-known speaker whose name was often in the papers, perhaps a professor or a radical Ohio mayor or a labor lawyer, to address them on up-to-date topics like municipal ownership in Europe, or the Russian Revolution, or the androcentric world, which showed women had as much right to vote as men, or non-resistance, a kind of Christianity that wasn't practical. Stevens didn't like that lecture much. Jane Addams spoke once about the children that lived in her neighborhood. He thought her talk the best of all. So did Georgia. He said to her that Jane Addams was as much of a saint as any of those old-timers that were burnt and pulled to pieces and fed to lions, and a useful kind of a saint as well, because she helped children instead of just believing in something or other. Georgia didn't answer his remark at the time, but nearly half an hour later, as she was bidding him good night, she had him repeat it to her, and the next day she told him that what he had said about Miss Addams was very interesting. They had organ music at these meetings and a collection, so that he felt it was the next thing to going to church. But Georgia, in arguing out the matter with herself, concluded that there was so little religion in the services that in attending them she violated the church's law against worshiping with heretics hardly more than if she went to a political meeting. She would never go to a regular Protestant service with Mason, even if he asked her. She made up her mind firmly on that point. So perhaps it was as well he didn't ask her. Her waking memories of Jim were now much fainter and dimmer. She tried not to think of him at all. She refused to let her mother or Al speak his name or make allusion to him. At the beginning, just after his departure, Mama had harped on the subject until she thought it would drive her crazy. Over and over and over again she traversed the same ground, about his being her husband, and Christian charity, and one more trial, and the disgrace of it, and that it was the first time such a thing ever happened in the family. Finally, in self-defense, and to save herself from being upset every night when she was tired and worn out anyway, she told her mother that the next time she mentioned Jim's name she would leave the room. And she only had actually to do this 3 times before poor mama succumbed, as she always did when she was met firmly. However, she still managed to say a volume in Jim's favor, with her deep sighs and her "Oh, Georgia's." But Georgia always pretended she didn't know the meaning of such signs and manifestations. Of course, especially at the beginning, her husband's face often came unbidden between her and her page, but she gathered up her will each time to banish it again, and it's surprising what a woman can do if she only makes up her mind and sticks to it. But her dreams were the trouble. Jim would enter them. She didn't know how to keep him out. And he always came, sometimes 2 or 3 nights in succession, to bring her pain. She usually appointed her Sunday rendezvous for an hour before noon at Shakespeare's statue in the park, and sailed off cheerily in her best bib and tucker to meet Mason, leaving behind her a fine trail of excuses, a complete new set each week, to explain to mama why she couldn't go to mass. On this particular morning she said she had a date with a girl-friend from the office. With the best intention in the world, she was never on time and always kept him waiting. She was so unalterably punctual for 6 days a week that the 7th day it was simply impossible. Stevens usually became slightly irritated during these few minutes, what business man wouldn't, and referred to his watch at 100-second intervals, determined to ask her once and for all why she wasted so much time in tardiness. But when finally he distinguished her slim little figure in the Sunday throng that was streaming toward him, his impatience left not a rack behind. They started gaily northward, bantering each other in urban repartee. As they passed Gray Columbus Hospital, their mood swerved suddenly, and they talked of sickness and death and immortality. Her belief was orthodox, but it did not hold her as vividly as it held the old folk in the old days. Had she lived nearer to the miracles of the sun going down in darkness and coming up in light, or thunderstorms and young oats springing green out of black, with wild mustard interspersed among them like deeds of sin, of the frost coming out of the ground, and the leaves dying and the trees sleeping, she would perhaps have lived nearer to the miracles of bread and wine, of Christ sleeping that the world may wake. But she lived in a place of obvious cause and effect. When the sun went down, the footlights came up for you if you had a ticket, and man's miracle banished God's even though you might be in the flying balcony and the tenor almost a block away. Thunderstorms meant that it was reckless to telephone, oats, wheat, and corn, something they controlled on the Board of Trade. The melting of the snows showed the City Hall was weak on the sewer side. What else could you expect of politicians? The dying leaves presaged the end of the Riverview season and young Al's excitement over the World Series. Living in the country puts a God in one's thoughts, for man did not make the country and its changes, yet they are there. Farmers pray for rain or its cessation, according to their needs. To live in the city is to diminish God and the seeming daily want of him, for man built his own city of steel and steam and stone, unhelped, did he not? God may have made the pansies, but he did not make the loop. His majesty is hidden from its people by their self-sufficing skill, and they turn their faces from him. West Siders do not pray for universal transfers. Never had Georgia questioned her faith. Its extent remained as great as ever. She had consciously yielded no part of her creed. But its living quality was infected by the daily realism of her life, as spring ice is honeycombed throughout with tiny fissures before its final sudden disappearance. So she talked to Stevens of her convictions, but in a calm, dispassionate way, without emotional fervor. Stevens' great-grandparents, whenever they referred to the Romanist Church, which was often, spoke of the Scarlet Woman, or the Whore of Babylon. His grandparents, products of a softer, weaker generation, stopped at adjectives, papist, Jesuitical, idolatrous. His parents receded still further from the traditions of the Pilgrims. Indeed, his father, being a popular horse doctor, kept his mouth shut altogether on the subject, and his mother seldom went beyond remarking that there was considerable superstition in the Catholic service and too much form to suit her. As for the son himself, he could as soon have quarreled about the rights and wrongs of the Mexican War as he would about religion. He wasn't especially interested in either. He thought there was a lot of flim-flam for women in all religion, especially in Catholicism. But it was an amiable weakness of the sex, like corsets. So he let Georgia run on, explaining her faith without interruption. Then most wretched luck befell them. Georgia looked up from the tips of her toes, being vaguely engaged, as she talked, in stepping on each large pebble in the gravel path, and her eyes rested squarely upon her mother. Mrs. Talbot mottled. Georgia blushed. All progress was temporarily arrested. Then the older woman puffed out her chest and waddled away with all the dignity at her summons. But she could not resist the Parthian shot, "What Celt can," and she turned to throw back over her shoulder, "Who's your girl friend, Georgia?" Her teeth clicked, and she continued her departure. Stevens realized that there had been a contretemps of some sort and that it was his place, as a man of the world, to laugh it off. "Who's the old pouter pigeon?" he inquired. "Mama." "Oh." Feeling that candor was now thrust upon her, Georgia proceeded to explain to Stevens that she had never explained about him to her mother, for mama couldn't possibly understand, being old-fashioned and prejudiced in some regards. "So you've made me fib for you," she finished. "Aren't you ashamed?" "Yes," said he, in truth much gratified by her clandestineness. "But what I don't see is," he began, then broke off. "Is what?" "Is why you should be so disturbed about your mother's knowing." "I've told you, for the sake of peace and a quiet life." "But what about your husband?" He blurted it out suddenly, the word that had crucified him since his one and only visit to her home, the word which he had kept dumb between them until now. "What about him? Doesn't he mind?" "He left me 6 months ago. You never supposed I would take a man's bread and fool him, did you, Mason?" She called him by his name for the first time. "I didn't know," he muttered. "I've been to hell and back thinking of it." "How did you suppose it would come out?" she asked, fascinated objectively by the drama of her life. "I felt we were playing bean bag with dynamite, and we ought to quit. Made up my mind, while I was waiting for you this morning, to tell you this must be the last time, because we were drifting straight into—" He paused. "Into what?" There was a touch of gentlest irony in her tone. "Into trouble, lots of it." There was a touch of apology in his. "And you didn't want trouble, lots of it?" Her irony was not less. "At least not on my account?" "I was thinking of what would be best for all of us. I was trying to do the square thing, the greatest happiness for the greatest number." There was a pause, unsympathetic. "Wasn't that right?" He ended with no great confidence. "Why, of course, perfectly right," she assented heartily. "It shows consideration. You considered the case systematically from all sides, yours and mine and my husband's, and the rest of the family's, and the rest of yours, too, I suppose, didn't you?" She looked extremely efficient and spoke in her business voice with a little snap to her words. She was quite unfair in taking this tack with unhappy Stevens, who, however often he thought of his duty in these twisted premises, would surely not have done it if she beckoned him away, for she owned the only two hands in the world which he wanted to hold. A woman, however, prefers to be the custodian of her own morals, and it gratifies her at most no more than slightly to find that her lover had been plotting with himself to preserve her virtue. It is for the man to ask and for her to deny, sadly but sweetly, and she doesn't care to be anticipated, especially when she is self-perceptibly interested. "But since you are already separated from—" "Yes, that makes it pleasanter all around, doesn't it?" She led him on most treacherously. "Why, of course, that's what I was saying," he blundered. "Now I can ask you to—" "Mason, I've a frightful headache, the sun perhaps, and I think I will go home and lie down, if you don't mind." He looked up in some amazement at the lord of day half hidden by the haze in his November station, and it suddenly occurred to him that woman is a various and mutable proposition always. "What's the matter with you, anyway?" "Nothing," she responded, with deliberate unconvincingness. "Nothing in the world but a headache." She held out her hand. "Don't bother to come with me. We might be seen. Good bye." And she was off. It was a winding gravel path, and she was lost behind a curving hedge before he started in pursuit. She quickened her pace when she heard his step behind, and it was almost a walking race before he overtook her. "Georgia!" he exclaimed, somewhat ruffled by her unreasonableness. She neither turned her head nor answered. "Georgia!" he repeated more loudly. Then he took her wrist and forcibly arrested her. "Please let me go," she requested with supreme dignity. "You are hurting me." "Not until you hear what I have to say. Will you marry me?" "Marry you?" She dropped her eyes before his frowning ones. The shoulders which had been thrown so squarely back seemed to yield like her will and drooped forward into softer lines. "Yes." He tightened his hold on her wrist. "Will you?" "I am a Catholic." "But isn't there some way around that? Your man of business believes there is some way around everything." "No. Divorce and remarriage aren't permitted to us." "Don't they ever annul a marriage?" "Not if it has been a marriage." A look of misery came over his face. She perceived it and went steadily on. "I had a child once, that died." He dropped her hand, unconsciously to himself, but she felt it as a clear signal between them. "You see how little you have known me," she said softly. "Poor old fellow, I'm sorry. Too bad it had to end like this." Her eyes were now swimming in tears which she did not try to conceal. "Don't you see, dear, that is why I kept putting off telling you things about my affairs, and why I had tried to keep it friendship, because I knew when we came as far as this we would have to stop." "It will never stop," he said tensely. "Never." Response seemed to sweep through her suddenly, bewildering her by its unexpected strength. "Perhaps not," she assented slowly, "if we dare." "Georgia," he pleaded, "you know that I—" "Yes," in a whisper, "I know." "And do you care, too?" She looked up, and her answer was plain for him to read. "More than you will ever know, Mason," she said. "Georgia, are you a devout Catholic? Does it mean all of life to you here and hereafter?" "No, not very devout. Nothing like mother, for instance. I have grown very careless about some things." "Would you always be governed by the teaching of the Church in this matter? Always? Never decide for yourself?" "When it came to such a big thing," she said slowly, "I don't think I'd dare disobey." "What are you afraid of? Future punishment?" "Why, yes, partly that," she smiled. "It isn't a very jolly prospect, you know." He was truly astonished. He supposed that everybody nowadays, even Catholics, had tacitly agreed to give up hell. Hell was too ridiculously unreasonable to be believed in any more. "Georgia," he asked, "have you ever looked much at the stars?" "Why, yes. Once in a while. Last Sunday evening at Bismarck Garden Al and I found the Dipper. It was just as plain is that what you mean? Of course I don't pretend to be much of an astronomer." "Some nights," he said, "when it's clear, I go up on the roof and lie on my back, and well, it's a great course in personal modesty. Some of those stars, those little points of light, are as much bigger than our whole world as an elephant is bigger than a mosquito, and live as much longer." "Of course," she answered, "we know that everything is bigger than people used to think, but still couldn't God have made it all just the same?" "Do you honestly believe," he rejoined, speaking very earnestly, intent on shaking her faith, if that were possible, "that whoever, or whatever, was big enough to put the stars in the sky, is small enough to take revenge forever on a tiny little molecule like you or me? Do you honestly suppose that after you are dead, perhaps a long time dead, this mighty God will hunt for you through all the heavens, and when he has found you, you poor little atom of a dead dot, that he will torment and pester you forever and ever because you had once for a space no longer than the wink of an eye acted according to the nature he gave you? If that is your God, he has put nothing in his universe as cruel as himself." She frowned in a puzzled way for a few seconds, looking at him with an odd little wide-eyed stare, then shook her head slowly. "Yes," said he in answer, "some day you will take your life in your own hands and use it. You're not the stuff they make nuns out of. There's too much vitality in you." "How old are you?" he asked suddenly. 26. 26 and ready to quit? I don't believe it." "You don't understand, Mason," she answered. "You can't. You're not a Catholic. Catholicism is different from all other creeds. It is not just something you think and argue about, but it has you. You belong to it. It is as much a part of you as your blood and bones." There was a finality in her voice, a resignation of self, which bespoke the vast accumulated will of the Church operating upon and through her. Stevens knew suddenly that she was not an individualized woman in the same sense that he was an individualized man, with the private possibility of doing what he pleased so long as he did not interfere with the private possibility of others. He realized that in certain important intimate matters, such as the one which had arisen between them, she was without power of decision, the decision having been made for her many centuries ago. And he felt the awe which comes to every man when first he is confronted by the Roman Catholic Church. "You mean there is no way out of it but death? Your husband's death?" His self-confidence seemed to have departed as if he, too, had met fate in the road. "Yes," she answered gently, "that is the only way." Then she smiled with some little effort, but still she smiled, for she detested gloom on her day off. "Oh, Mason," said she, "why wasn't grandpa a Swede?" He looked at her with amazement, and not without a trace of disapprobation, for her eyes were dancing. Was she actually making jokes about his misery, to say nothing of hers, if indeed she felt any? He was learning more about women every minute. Now she was practically giggling. He frowned deeper and sighed. Perhaps everything was for the best after all. He might as well tell her so, too. No reason to make himself wretched for something she seemed to think hilariously humorous. "Well, Georgia, I must say," he began portentously. 'Twas the voice of the husband, almost. She could hear him complain. Whereat she simply threw back her head and laughed again. He noticed, as he had often noticed, that her strong little teeth were white and regular, that her positive little nose was straight and slender, and the laughter creases about her eyes reminded him of the time she thought it such fun to be caught in Ravinia Park in the rain without an umbrella. So presently he tempered his frown, then put it away altogether, and his eyes twinkled and he turned the corners of his mouth up instead of down. "Oh, dear me," he mocked, half in fun and half not. "As the fellow says, we can't live with 'em and we can't live without 'em." But she, who had been reading him like a book in plain print, asked, "Come, tell auntie your idea of a jolly Sunday in the park with your best girl. To sit her on a bench and make her listen while you mourn for the universe?" "But what are we going to do about it?" he asked solemnly. "That's what I want to know." "Do?" she responded, with a certain gay definiteness. "Do nothing." "You mean not see each other any more at all?" he asked desperately. "I absolutely refuse." "No, silly, of course I don't mean that. We'll go on just as before, friends, comrades, pals." "When we love each other, when we've told each other we love each other?" "Certainly. What's that got to do with it?" "It would be the merest pretense," he declared solemnly. "Then let's begin the pretense now, and go up and throw a peanut at the elephant. Come along." She hooked her arm into his. Her levity of behavior undoubtedly got past him at times. "Georgia," he was once more on the verge of remonstrance, "if you cared as you say you do, if you loved me as I She unhooked her arm, and now she was serious enough. "Don't you understand," she said, "what I mean? We can't talk about that any more." "You mean not at all?" "Precisely." "But what if I can't conceal the most important thing in my whole life? What if I can't smirk and smile about it? What if I am not as good an actor as you? What if I can't pretend? What then?" He was very, very fierce with her. "Then I suppose I'll have to go home." They stood irresolute, facing each other, neither wishing to carry it too far. "Not that that would be much fun. Oh, come, don't be silly. Let's go attack the elephant. What must be, you know." She paused to allow him time to yield with grieved dignity, then she headed for the animal house. He trailed in silence about half a step behind her during the first 100 yards, but finally sighed and surrendered and then fell into step and pretended during the rest of the afternoon with quite decent success. So his education began. And though he was by no means pliable material, she managed, being vastly the more expert, to keep him pretending, with hardly a lapse throughout the winter. She found it more difficult, however, to keep herself pretending. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Rebellion, by Joseph M. Patterson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Moxey was a Jew boy and a catcher. His last name ended in ski, and he came from the West Side ghetto. His father and mother came from the Pale in Russia when Moxey's elder brother Steve was in arms and before Moxey himself appeared. Moxey would have been captain of the Prairie View Semi-Pro Baseball Club, if merit ruled the world. But there was the crime of 19 centuries ago against him, so they made McLaughlin captain. George's 16-year-old brother Al played third base. The Prairie Views had one triumph in the morning, it being Sunday, the day for 2 and sometimes 3 games. They had the use of one of the diamonds on a public playground from Donovan, the wise cop. I have seen Donovan keep peace and order among 18 warring lads from 16 to 20 years old by a couple of looks, a smile, and a silence. When there was money on the game, too. There had been good material wasted in Donovan. Properly environed and taught the language, though he doesn't depend on language very much, he could have been presiding officer of the French Chamber of Deputies, and presided. It was the 9th inning, last half, tie score, 2 out, 3 on, with 2 and 3 on the batter. In other words, the precise moment when the fictionist is allowed to step in. Moxie up. He fouled off a couple. The coaches screeched. The umpire, who was also stakeholder, dripped a bit freer and hoped Donovan would stick around for a few seconds longer. The pitcher took a short wind-up and the ball, which seemed to start for the platter, reached Moxie in the neighborhood of the heart. He collapsed. They rallied round the umpire. "He done it on purpose, the sheeny! He done it on purpose, I tell you! He run into it!" "Naw, you're a liar!" "Prove it!" "It's a dead ball. Take your base. Come in there, youse," waving to the man on third. "We win! Give us our money!" All participated but Moxie, who lay moaning on the ground by home plate. Donovan strolled out to the debate and smiled his magic smile. "Take your base," bawled the emboldened ump, and waved the run in. Al got $5 for the day's playing and $3 for the day's betting, and the Prairie Views walked off, bats conspicuous on shoulders, yelling "Yah!" at the enemy. "Gee," said Moxie to his playmates when they reached the family entrance. "Me for the big irrigation." And it was so. Moxie shifted his foot, called his little circle around him close, and then inserted his dark, fleshless talon into his baseball shirt. "That gave me an awful wallop what win the game," he said. "If I hadn't slipped me little pad in after the 8, it might 'a' put me away, understand?" He took out his protection against dead balls, an ingenious and inconspicuous felt arrangement to be worn under the left arm by right-handed batters. And all present felt again that there had been injustice in the preference of McLaughlin. Whenever they asked Moxie where he lived, he answered "West," and let it go at that. He always turned up for the next game, no matter how often plans had been changed since he had last seen any of them. That was all they knew about him. He caught for them, often won for them, drank beer with them, and then disappeared completely until the next half-holiday. Perhaps Al was his most intimate friend, and Al was the only one who learned his secret. "Say, Al," he blurted out almost fiercely one evening, "your folks is Irish, ain't they?" "Irish-American," corrected Al. "Well, mine's Yiddishers, and the most Yiddishers you ever see." Moxie seemed very bitter about it, and Al waited for more. "My old man, well," Moxie swallowed. It seemed to Al as if he would not go on, but finally it came out with a rush. "He pushes a cart. Yes, sir, honest to God, he pushes a cart. I thought maybe I ought to tell you, Al." "He does?" It was a shock to the Irish-American, which showed in his tone. "Yes, sir, he does," Moxie answered defiantly. "And if you don't like it, why, well, I won't say nothin' ugly to you, Al. You're only like the rest. So long." Al threw his arm around the other's shoulder. "Forget it, Moxie," which was the only oath ever taken in this particular David and Jonathan affair. Not long afterwards, Moxie proposed to Al attendance at a prize fight just across the state line, the Illinois laws being unfavorable to such exhibitions of manly skill or brutality, whichever it is. It was Al's first fight. They boarded a special train, filled with coarse men bent upon coarse pleasure. But then, if they had been bent upon refined pleasure, they wouldn't have been coarse, or it wouldn't have been pleasure. The prize-fighting question illustrates well the gulf between the social and the individual conscience, and demonstrates that the whole is sometimes considerably greater than the sum of its parts. Probably 8 out of 10 men in this country enjoy seeing two hardy young micks belt each other around a padded ring with padded gloves. But they hesitate to come out in the open and proclaim their enjoyment, for fear of writing themselves down brutes, and the deepest yearning of the American people at the present day is to be gentlemanly and ladylike. So, whenever sparring matches are proposed, the community works itself up into a state of fake indignation. All the softer and sweeter elements telegraph the governor, and if that isn't enough, pray for him. and inasmuch as the governor gets no immoral support on the other side from those who are afraid of jeopardizing their gentlemanliness, he yields and appears in the newspapers as a strong man who dared beard the sports, whereas he was really a frightened politician who didn't dare beard the Christian endeavorers. One of the most illuminating essays of the late and great William James concerned Chautauqua Lake. He spent a week at that beautiful camp where sobriety and industry, intelligence and goodness, orderliness and ideality, prosperity and cheerfulness pervade the air. There were popular lectures by popular lecturers, a chorus of 700 voices, kindergartens, secondary schools, every sort of refined athletics, and perpetually running soda fountains. There was neither zymotic disease, poverty, drunkenness, crime or police. There was culture, kindness, cheapness, equality, in short, what mankind has been striving for under the name of civilization, a foretaste of what human society might be, were it all in the light, with no suffering and no dark corners. And yet, when he left the camp, he quotes himself as saying to himself, "Oof! What a relief! Now for something primordial to set the balance straight again. This order is too tame, this culture too second rate, this goodness too uninteresting. This human drama without a villain or a pang, this community so refined that ice cream soda is the utmost offering it can make to the brute animal in man. This city simmering in the tepid lakeside sun, this atrocious harmlessness of all things, I cannot abide with them." But whether he could or not, the rest of us have to, and the country moves Chautauquaward with decorous haste. From anti-canteen and anti-racing to anti-fights and anti-tights, the antis seem to have it, the antis have it, and the bill is passed. Al viewed this national tendency with mixed feelings. With joy when he tasted forbidden fruit and sneaked across the state line with Moxie in a special train full of bartenders and policemen off duty, and gay brokers and butchers to see more than the law allowed. With sorrow when he considered the future of his country as a gray, flat, and feminine plain. The preliminaries had been fought off. There was the customary nervous pause before the wind-up. Young men with official caps forced their ways between the packed crowds with "peanuts, ham sandwiches, and cold bottled beer." The announcer, a tall young man in shirt sleeves, who looked as if he might be a fairly useful citizen himself in case of a difference, made the customary appeal. "Gentlemen, on account of the smoke in the atmosphere, I am requested to request you to quit smoking." Pause. "The boxers find it difficult to box in this atmosphere, and you will witness a better encounter if you do." Applause, but no snuffing of torches. "The final contest of this evening's proceedings," called the announcer, first to one side of the ring, then to the other, "will be between Johnny Fittione and Kid O'Mara, both of Chicago, for the bantamweight championship of the world." Hand claps and whistlings. But the announcer, being gifted with the dramatic instinct, knew how to work up his climaxes, which, so far as he personally was concerned, would culminate with the tap of the gong for the first round. It was his affair to have the house seething with excitement when that gong tapped. "Gentlemen," continued the announcer. Then he spied two plumes waving in the middle distance and made the amend, to delighted sniggers, "Ladies and gentlemen, I take pleasure in introducing Runt Keogh of Philadelphia." A diminutive youth with a wise face stepped in the ring and bobbed his head to the cheers, and muttered something to the announcer. "Runt Keogh hereby challenges the winner of this bout for the championship of the world in the 115-pound class, to a finish." A tumult ensued. The runt backed out of the ring to hoots of "four-flusher" and howls of approbation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I now take pleasure in introducing to you Mr. Ed Fittione, father and handler of Johnny Fittione, who wears the bantamweight crown of the world." The crowd made evident its vehement gratitude for Ed's share in Johnny's creation. "Gee," whispered Moxey to Al, as they sat close and rapt, with shining eyes on the dollar seats high up and far away. "They'd tear up the chairs for Johnny's mother if they'd produce her." But now something was happening by the east entrance. The cheering suddenly ceased. A low anxious buzzing whisper ran over the entire assemblage. Men stood up to look eastward regardless of monitions from behind to sit down. Something was cutting through the crowd from the east entrance to the ring. It was Kid O'Mara, in his cotton bathrobe, preceded by a gigantic mulatto and followed by two smaller Caucasians. Moxey's bony fingers dug suddenly into Al's biceps. "Kid, you gotta do it, kid, you gotta," he whispered. "Oh, for God's sake, kid." Al was surprised. "Are you with O'Mara?" he asked. "Am I with him?" answered Moxey, with a sob in his voice. "Am I with him? He's my cousin." "O'Mara's your cousin?" "Lipowski's his right name, same as mine. Look at his beak and see." There was no doubt of it. Kid O'Mara's proboscis corroborated Moxey's claim. Johnny's entrance a few minutes later was still more effective and his reception warmer. Fight fans are courtiers, always with the king. When the two boys stripped, Johnny showed short and stocky, the Kid lank and lithe. Johnny depended on his punch, the Kid on his reach. They fought 10 rounds and it was a draw, probably a just decision inasmuch as the adherents of each contestant proclaimed that the referee had been corrupted against their man. Besides, a draw meant another fight between them with plenty of money in the house. This evening in Fistiana was perhaps the most powerful single experience which influenced Al at this period of his life. For a long time he sat silent beside Moxey on the return trip, pondering the physical beauty of Johnny and the Kid and ruefully comparing their bodies with his own. He sighed. "And now I suppose your cousin'll go out and kill it tonight." "Not him," Moxey reassured. "He never touches it in any form or shape, understand." "He's training all the time?" continued Al, bent on deciphering the secret ways of greatness. "Yep, so you might say." "Oh." Then Al relapsed into silence to wrestle with the angel of training all the time. Like most young fellows, Al regarded his body as the source of all the happiness that amounted to anything. The brain was merely its adjunct, its money maker and guide. Its operations might lead to life, but they were not life like the body's. It flashed upon him in the train bound home from the fight that he might achieve joy in either of two ways, by going in for sports or sporting, by perfecting the animal in him or by abusing it, by getting into as good shape as Kid O'Mara or into as bad shape as the pale waster crumpled in the seat across the aisle. So began a struggle in him, not yet ended, between the Ormuzd and Ahriman of physical condition. His high achievement thus far has been 6th place in a river marathon swimming race. His completest failure, 36 successive drunken hours in the restricted district. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Rebellion by Joseph M. Patterson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Al wasn't much of a head at books. Georgia persuaded him to start in high school, but he soon came out, for he found that it interfered with the free expression of his personality. There were too many girls about one, and he became extremely apprehensive lest he develop into a regular la-di-da. Georgia was more afraid of his developing into a regular rough and tough, so they had a very intense time of it in the flat while the question was under discussion. Mother Talbot sided with neither of them. She wanted Al to continue his instructions, but in the institutions under the direction of the church. She couldn't reconcile herself to Al's getting his learning in a place where the very name of God was banned, as it was in the public schools. Indeed, in her opinion, and you couldn't change it, no, not if you argued from now until the clap of doom, the main trouble with everything nowadays was impiety and weakening of faith, brought about how? Why, by these public schools, these atheist factories that were ashamed of the Savior. For her part, she couldn't see her son going to one of them with any peace of mind, and she wanted them both to remember that he would go against her consent and in spite of her prayers. What's more, if he was undutiful in this manner, he'd probably find himself sitting between a Jew and a nigger, which she must say would serve him right. Did Georgia think, she inquired on another occasion, that the priests weren't up to teaching Al, or what? To be sure, learning was a fine thing for a boy starting out in the world, and she approved of it as much as anyone. But who ever heard of an ordinary priest who hadn't more wisdom in his little finger than a public school teacher had in her whole silly head? In a church school he would receive instructions not only in temporal, but also in divine learning. He would be taught not merely history and mathematics and such like, but also goodness and pure living, which were far more important for any young fellow. But Georgia could not be convinced. She said she had been to a convent, and if she had it to do over again she would go to a public high school, just as Al, who not only was a considerate and loving brother, but also could see clearly how sorry he would be in after life if he didn't, was about to decide to do. She finally had her way, and Al picked up his burden, and found it not so difficult to carry after all, for he joined the Alpha Beta Gammas and rose rapidly in that order, becoming its most expert and weariless initiator, a very terror to novitiates. But precisely at the moment when the Alpha Bets reached the zenith of their glory, the skies fell upon them, the edict coming from above that all fraternities must go. Al went too. The place was indubitably fit for nothing but girls now. And whatever Georgia might say, this time he was going to stick, for in the last analysis she was a female, and her words subject to discount. He stuck, discounting the female, and she was distressed like a mother robin in the tree whose youngling, that has just fluttered down, persists in hopping out of the long grass upon the shaven lawn, when, as all Robin Hood knew, there were cats in the kitchen around the corner of the house. It is the impulse of youth to travel far in search of marvels, a vestige, so it is said, of the nomadic stage of human development, when the race itself was young. It was as member of a demonstration crew for a vacuum cleaning machine that Al enjoyed his wanderjahr. He went among strange people and heard the babbling of many tongues without passing out of Chicago. Like a reporter or a mendicant friar of old, he knocked on all doors. The slouch, the slattern, the miser and the saint opened to him. The pale young mother with a child at her breast and another at her skirts and both her eyes black and blue. Or the gray old sewing woman who for her plainness had known neither the bliss nor the horror of a man. One rolling mill husky in South Chicago chased him downstairs with a stick of wood, and another heaved his big arm around him and made him come in and wait while little Jerry took the pail to the corner. He came upon a household where one life was coming as another was going, and a little girl of 12, who could no longer contain the excitement of the day beneath her small bosom, followed him into the entryway as he hastily backed out, and whispered between gasps to catch her breath her version of family history in the making. He learned early the value of the smooth tongue, the timely bluff and the signed contract, and grew rapidly from boy to man in the forcing bed of the city. Meanwhile Moxie, not yet 20, was swimming in a sea of sentiment. There was a young Italian girl who worked in the paper box factory. "Angelica," said he, "come to the dance tonight." "Nit," she responded. "Why?" "Oh, they'd give me the laugh if I—" She paused tactfully. "Account of—" He drew a semicircle about his nose and laughed unhappily. "Well?" It was explicit enough. Can't see a guinea has anything on a Yiddisher. Tit for tat in love's badinage. I'm no guinea, I'm not, she exclaimed passionately. I'm Amurrican. So am I, he answered briskly. I'm Amurrican, and I don't wear no hoops in my ears. Perhaps that would hold her for a while. It did. She retreated in tears, thinking of her sire's shame. But her bosom was deep, and her lips were as red as an anarchist flag, and her little nose tilted the other way. So why stay mad at her? Her eyebrows nearly met in the center, though she was only 16. And as for dancing, well, he'd look 'em all over in vaudeville, and he couldn't see where they had anything on her. More steps, perhaps, but no more looks or class. And Angelica went to dances with Irishers, loafers who'd never take care of her, and she wouldn't go with him. Well, he'd see if she wouldn't. He'd own that little nose of hers some day, or know why. He'd make money. He'd be rich. He'd woo her with rings and pins and tickets of admission. He would be irresistible in his lavishness. Johnny Fitton, bantamweight champion of the world, contributed to the discomfiture of those members of his race who liked to dance with Angelica, for on his second time out with Moxey's cousin he lost the decision by a shade. Moxey knew he would beforehand. Johnny redeemed himself in their next encounter, however, and put the cousin away, so there would be no question about it. And again Moxey, knowing beforehand that he would, prospered and showered Angelica with brooches. Also, he purchased an equity in a 2-story frame cottage with Greeks in the basement and hunkies above. One shouldn't, he reflected, depend too much on sports to keep up the supply of brooches. Aggie, said he, as they returned from a dance together, take a peep at this. He extracted a diamond solitaire pin from his tie, and stopping under an arc light, gave it to her to examine. I seen it, she snapped. You been flashing it at me all evening. Think I'm blind? Make up into a nice ring, wouldn't it? Angelica was wise. She knew what men were after. She didn't work in a paper box factory for nothing. She would let them go just so far, to be sure, if they were good fellows, but she could draw the line. Indeed, she had already drawn it once or twice with 5 thick little fingers on astonished cheeks. She measured her distance from the ardent Hebrew unconscious of his danger, but still she paused for greater certainty. Did the diamond mean another proposition, or was it maybe a proposal this time? I got my uncle in jail in Napoli, she said very quietly. I'm sorry, he answered simply. But what of it? They had my brother Steve in Pontiac once. My uncle he killed the man that spoiled his daughter. That ain't nothin' to be ashamed of, Aggie. He spoke kindly, seeking to console her, and took her small and stubby hand gently in his long sinewy ones. He done right. She never let him know, for her dignity, how low she once had feared he held her, and she kissed him good night many times. They say you people are good to their women, Moxey, she whispered. Ours ain't always. She paused. Gee, my pa'll have a fit. Moxey laughed. Mine too, I guess, said he. But we won't have to ask them for nothing. Understand. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Rebellion by Joseph M. Patterson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. You'll stand up with me, won't you? Moxey asked, a bit anxiously. Sure, of course, said Al. It's at night, and... Here was to be at least one wedding where the groom was no lay figure. Dress suits de rigueur, understand? Sure, of course, Al assented impatiently. Did Moxey think he didn't know anything? We ain't going to tell the old folks for a couple of weeks to save hard feelings on both sides. That's our motto. And the kids is to be Catholics. She stood pat on that. Sure, of course. What did you expect 'em to be, kikes? Perhaps Al spoke a trifle too explicitly, for Moxey flushed as he frequently did. It was his last remaining signal to the world that his hide wasn't as tough as he pretended. "I ain't marryin' her just because she's a peach," Moxey rhapsodized. "But she is. Wait till you see her and I'll leave it to you. But she's got principle, too. Her uncle killed a fellow for wronging his daughter, and Aggie says he done right, if he is still doing time in the old country. Oh, there's plenty of principle in Dagoes, you can say what you like. When you go foolin' around their women, you gotta take a chance." It was as if Moxey had pressed a bell in his friend's mind and opened a chamber there, where vague shapes appeared and suspicion had been gathering. For Al had observed Georgia's mysteries and evasions, her care before her mirror, her new hats and pretty ribbons, her day-long Sunday absences. Twice he had met her on the street, walking and chatting most gaily with some strange man. Besides, his mother had plainly hinted that all might not be right. "What do you think a fellow ought to do if a man's after his sister?" Al asked slowly. "This unwritten law thing don't seem to work any more except down south." "You can't lay down no rule," said Moxey. "Depends on if you like your sister." "If you do?" "Then go the limit and take a chance with your jury." He paused and great shame came to his cheeks again. "I had a sister onct, and well, you understand, I sometimes thought I oughta killed him. But I never did. I kept askin' myself, what's the good of killin' him now? Becky's done for anyhow, and it'd just do for me, too. The time to look out for a girl is beforehand, not afterwards." There was no doubt about that, especially in theory. But Al contemplated, somewhat dubiously, the task of safeguarding Georgia. She was so blamed independent. She might say he was impertinent, or she might just laugh at him. She was fairly certain, at all events, not to acquiesce readily in any watch and ward policy which he might seek to institute for her benefit. Still, in a well-conducted family, the men were supposed to look out for the women and keep the breath of dishonor from them. He was the man of the family now, even if he was only 18, and so it was up to him to find out if Georgia was in danger, and if she was, to get her out of it beforehand. "I seen your sister once," remarked Moxey, guessing his thoughts. Al was silent. "Looked like she could take care of herself." "Oh, she's got good sense," said Al. "But you know the riddle. Why's a woman like a ship? Because it takes a man to manage her." "Yes," assented Moxey, "and they have more respect, understand, for the fellow who can say no to 'em when it's right." So after supper that evening, instead of going over to the pool parlor, Al stayed at home, waiting for his mother to go to bed, when he could have a talk with Georgia and pump her and find out about this strange man she knew, and if necessary, say no. His mother drew up to the lamp and darned his socks and talked on endlessly, it seemed to him. He felt a little abused when 9 o'clock came, which was her bedtime, and still she made no move to go. She did get a little tiresome at times. He would acknowledge that frankly to himself, though he would not let her see it for worlds, except by staying away from her most of the time, and not paying attention to her when he was with her. If his most affectionate greeting of the day came as a rule, when he said, "Good night, mother dear," he didn't realize it. And it would have amazed him to know that sometimes she sniffled for as much as half an hour after she went to bed, because he had shown so plainly that he was glad to be rid of her. She supposed in her sadness that he was an unnatural, almost unparalleled example of unfilial ingratitude, not suspecting he was only a rear rank file in the ever victorious army of youth. Al wound his watch. "Gee, 10:15," he remarked, through a yawn. He stretched himself elaborately. Mother was certainly delaying the game. Until she went he couldn't have his roundup with Georgia, who was in one of her after-supper reading spells, and had hardly said a word all evening. She now had a fad for those little books bound in imitation green leather that constituted the World's Epitome of Culture series and cost 35 cents apiece, or 2 magazines and an extra Sunday paper, as she put it. She had been through 20 of them already and was now on her 21st. He didn't deny that it was creditable to go in for culture. If that was the sort of thing she liked, why, as the fellow says, he supposed she liked that sort of thing. It's a free country. But as for him, when he was tired with the day's work, he thought he was entitled to a little recreation, a game of pool, a couple of glasses of beer, maybe a swim in a Nat. He wasn't bad at the middle distances. And he couldn't see drawing up a chair under a lamp and going to work again, for that was what it amounted to on a little green epitome that you had to study over to get the meaning, or maybe look in the dictionary, as she was doing now. She had told him that they were more interesting than the other kind of books, and had even got him to start on a couple she said he was sure to like, because they were so exciting. Marco Polo's Travels and Froissart's Chronicles. But they didn't excite him any, and he made only about 30 pages in each of them. Indeed, it was his private opinion that Georgia was more or less bunking herself with this upward and onward stuff. She fell for it because it helped her feel superior. And then she worked herself up to believing she really liked it, because people were surprised she knew so much and said she had a naturally fine mind. A vicious circle. In all of which cogitations he was perhaps not entirely astray, though her chief incitement was more concrete than he supposed. She wanted to impress Stevens in particular, rather than people in general. She was determined to keep even with him so that he could never talk down to her as to a mere womanly woman who held him by sex and nothing more. When at last Mrs. Talbot arose, Al hastened to her, kissed her affectionately, slipped his arm around her, impelled her towards the door, opened it rapidly, kissed her again, closed it firmly behind her, lit a cigarette, and began, "Georgia, I want to have a heart-to-heart with you." "In a second." She read the last half page of her chapter so rapidly that she was compelled to read it over again for conscience sake, then inserted her bookmark and turned to him. "Fire away." "Who's the mysterious stranger?" She had known it was coming for the last half hour. From the corner of her eye she had spied the importance of the occasion actually oozing out of young Al. At first she thought of sidestepping the interview, but eventually decided not to, partly to please the lad, and more still to hear how her case would stand when discussed aloud. She had been in a most chaotic state of mind ever since the agreement with Stevens to pretend. That which wasn't clear then was hazier now. She was of 10 minds a day whether to give in to her lover or to give in to the church. Now she would listen to Georgia and Al talk about the case as if they were 2 other people, in the hope of finding guidance in her eavesdropping. "He is a man in the office whom I like," she answered. "How much?" "A lot." "And he does too?" "Yes, a lot." You know I hate to preach, but—" Hesitation. "You think you will, all the same. Go on, I'm listening." "You know I'm liberal. If you were just fooling with this fellow, I'd never peep, honest, I wouldn't." She smiled. "I'll promise to fool only with my next beau." "Now, this is no laughing matter," he rebuked her levity. "If you're really stuck on each other, it may bust you all to pieces before you're done with it, unless you quit in time." "What do you mean by quit?" "Give up seeing him altogether. It would be safer." "Yes, so it would. But what's that got to do with it?" "A woman can't afford to take chances," he retorted impressively. "It seems to me the people who get the most fun out of life are the ones who do take chances. Your little tin hero, Roosevelt, for instance. You like him because he'd rather hunt a lion or a trust than a sure thing. Jim Horan didn't eat smoke for the money in it, but because he thought a wall might fall on him some day, or might not. That's what he wanted to find out. Well, perhaps I want to find out if a wall will fall on me some day, or not." Al was astounded. There was something more than bold, something hardly decent, in the comparison of her own dubious flirtation to a great fireman's martyrdom or a soldier statesman sportsman's courage and career. "But, Georgia," he expostulated, "you speak like a man in a manhole. Horan and Roosevelt did their duty taking chances." "Rubbish," she said. "They acted according to their natures, and I will act according to mine some day." He looked unutterably distressed, for he loved her, and foresaw ruin enfolding her. He knew that women aren't allowed to act according to their natures, if their natures are as natural as all that. "I haven't seen Jim for over a year," she went on, "nor heard of him for 10 months. He may be dead. He is the same as dead to me. My heart is the heart of a widow, grateful for her weeds. The church may say otherwise, and I might obey unwillingly, but my own being tells me that there is nothing wrong in my love for Mason Stevens, any more than it's sin to breathe air or drink water. That's how we're made. When I lived with Jim I played no tricks. But that's over now. It's over for good. What's the difference whether he's under the sod or above it, so far as I'm concerned?" Her eyes were alight, and she walked back and forth, gesticulating like a Beveridge, persuading herself that what she wished was just because she wished it. "I've got a few good years of youth left. I'll not throw them away for a religious quibble." "You mean divorce and marry again openly." "What does the ceremony matter? I'm not sure we'd take the trouble of going through it." She shrugged her shoulders. "The church says that it means nothing anyway, that it makes the sin no less." "But, Georgia," he was beginning now to fear for her common sense, "for God's sake, if you do such a thing, first go through the civil form anyway." She laughed triumphantly. She had caught him. "There you spoke your heart. Of course we'll have a legal marriage. You see the church hasn't convinced you either that divorce and remarriage is the same as adultery." She had crystallized her vague desires into positive determination by the daring sound of her own words. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Rebellion by Joseph M. Patterson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Al reflected moodily that arguing with a woman never gets you anything. If he had been trying to interest Georgia in a vacuum cleaner, he would have known better than to start in by arousing her to a fervor for brooms. Now he would have to wait a few days until she had cooled out, and then try her on a different tack, appealing to her affection and begging her not to bring disgrace upon the whole family. She was half sitting, half kneeling on the window seat, her elbows on the sill, her cheeks in her hands, looking out into the dim urban night. Directly to the south, over the loop, where Chicago was wide awake and playing, the diffused electric radiance was brightest and highest, a man-made borealis. She took pride in her big city. It was unafraid. It followed no rules but its own, and didn't always follow them. It owned the future in fee and pitied the past. It said, not ought I, but I will. It was modern, just as she was modern. She was more characteristically the offspring of her city than of her mother, for she was new, like Chicago, and her mother was old, like the church. So she pondered in the pleasant afterglow of decision, buttressing her resolve. The bell rang from the vestibule below, and she went to the speaking tube to find out what was wanted. "Yes?" she inquired, then without saying anything more she walked slowly to her room. "Who was it?" asked Al, but she closed the door behind her without answering. Funny things, women. He went to the tube himself. "What you want?" "It's Jim." "Jim?" Well, for the love of goodness, godness, Agnes, do you want to come up? Yes, if it's all right. Al pressed the door opener, but before climbing the stairs, Jim shouted another question through the tube. Wasn't that Georgia who spoke first? Yes. Well, why did she... How is she, anyway? Fine. Come along. There was a great change in Jim. He must have taken off 40 or 50 pounds. His eyes were clear, his skin healthily brown, and he had hardened up all over. He looked a good 10 years younger than the last time Al saw him, except for one thing, that his hair had thinned out a great deal. He was almost bald on top. They shook hands, and Jim gave him a solid grip. "Cheese," said the younger fellow heartily, "you look good. Primed for a battle, almost." He put his fingers on the other's biceps. Jim drew up his clenched fist, showing a very respectable bunch of muscle. "More than there ever used to be, eh?" he asked, smiling broadly. Al whistled, stepped back for a better look at the miracle, and whistled. "And yet they say they never come back. How'd you do it?" "Working. Rousty on a dredge in Oklahoma." "Rousty?" "Toted coal to the firemen, later got to firing myself, on the night shift. We kept her going steady. Funny thing, irrigating way out there. To hell and gone, in the middle of frogs barking, and the cattle bawling feeding your old 30-horse and watching the old scoop lifting out her yard of sludge every 6 minutes. You got so it seemed the most natural thing in the world, but it ain't, is it?" "What did they pay?" "50 and board. But the money's being in the business. Me and our day trainman was talking of getting shares in a dredge. There's work there for 1,000 years. Where's Georgia?" Al nodded his head toward her door. "So's not to see me." Al nodded. "I came clear from there in the busy season for the sight of her, and I didn't come alone. I've 300 here," said Jim, taking a roll of bills from his pocket. "And to be turned down this way, with my heart full of love." He was greatly moved, and he showed it, for his lip trembled and his voice shook. Al was sorry for him. "Aw, she'll come around. She's got a stubborn streak, you know that, but she does right in the end. Give her time. I'll talk to her." Jim felt sure that she must have heard their conversation, especially the last part of it, for he had talked quite distinctly, and he remembered from the old days how readily all the sounds in the flat penetrated into that room. He got on his hands and knees, and looked at the crack beneath her door to see if her room was lighted. "She's sitting in the dark," he whispered. "Would it be all right to knock?" "I don't know," said Al uncertainly. Jim knocked softly, then a little more loudly, but there was no answer. He put his ear to the door to listen, then tiptoed away. "She's crying," he whispered to Al. "Crying to beat the band. Those heavy, deep kind of sobs. I could barely hear her. Must have her face in the pillow. Now, what do you know about that?" "That's a good sign," said Al. "Means she's coming around. When she just turns white and don't speak—" Jim privately opined that he understood Georgia's moods vastly better than Al ever would, and was in no need of instruction on this subject. "You mean when she has one of her silences," he said, giving the thing its proper name. "Yes, that's when you can't handle her. But now she's begun to melt already. So tomorrow evening come for supper, and I bet my shirt you are all made up in 30 minutes." Jim wrung his hand. "You're a thoroughbred, Al. And take this from me, I've learned sense. If I get her back, I'll keep her. No more booze, never one drop." He counted out 4 $5 bills upon the center table. "That's what I borrowed when I quit," he explained. As he reached the door he turned to confirm his happy appointment. 6:30 tomorrow evening? End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Rebellion by Joseph M. Patterson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The following morning brother and sister rode downtown together in the cars. "Don't you think you might have consulted me before asking Jim to supper?" she inquired. "Don't be foolish. You were locked in your room," he replied cheerfully. She worked all day in that state of suppressed excitement which presages great events, from the first ride on the lodge goat to the codicil part of Uncle's will. Everything she saw or touched was more vivid than usual to her senses. Her typewriter keys seemed picked out in the air against a deep perspective, their lettering very heavy, their clicking singularly loud. One of the little flags caught in a ventilation grill, and instead of fluttering out freely, flapped and bellied, making a small snapping noise. A flag wasn't meant to do that, so she crossed the big room, pulled up a chair and released it, somewhat to the surprise of the youth sitting directly beneath it. The old man, usually rapid enough with his letters, seemed hopelessly slow and awkward this morning, and she had to bite her tongue to keep from helping him out with the proper word when he got stuck. He was leaning back in his swivel chair, wasting interminable time with pauses and laryngeal interjections, the tips of his fingers together, his eyes half closed, droning out his sentences. He wore a little butterfly tie to-day, blue spots on brown, just below his active Adam's apple and thin corded neck. Under the point of his chin was a little patch which his razor had skipped, hopelessly white. She wondered what could be in it for him any more, and why he didn't retire. She rattled off her letters, then added a note for Stevens. "Dinner to-night?" and left it in the S compartment of the letters received box. When he came in later for his afternoon mail he caught her eye and nodded, and on the way out of the old man's office stopped at her desk for a few hasty words. "What time, and where?" "Wherever you like. At 6:30. "Max's?" he suggested. "We'll have snails." "Oh, what a perfectly dear place, in every sense of the word." "My treat," he said. "No." "You never dined with me before. You might let me celebrate." "We'll celebrate anyway. Dutch. Make it Max's." He didn't prolong the argument. They had long before made a compact that the expenses of their expeditions should be shared. "I suppose," he inquired, "your 6:30 really means 7. I've an appointment. Might keep me till then, unless—" "I'll meet you on the stroke of 1/2 past," she said, and was as good as her word. They had snails à la Max, whereof the frame is finer than the picture, as well as Maxian frogs' legs, boned and wrapped in lettuce leaves, and, not without misgivings, a bottle of claret. Stevens, unaware that it was their last time of pretending, abided by the rules. They talked shop and shows and vacations. Georgia slipped in a few appropriate words concerning her cultural progress. They were both somewhat severe upon the orchestra, because there was too much noise to the music. So Mason beckoned the head waiter and "requested" the barcarolle from Tales of Hoffman, and they floated off in it toward the edge of what they knew. It is said that most people have at least two personalities. In this respect, Georgia was like them. One side of her was the woman of 1850, and the times previous. Whether mother, wife, daughter, maiden or mistress, primarily something in relation to man, her individuality submerged in this relationship as a soldier's individuality is submerged in his uniform. The other aspect of Georgia's nature was that of the new woman, the woman hoped for in 1950. Bold, determined, taught to think, relentless in defense of her own personality, insistent that men shall have less and she shall have more sexual freedom. She is first of all herself, and only next to that something to a man. When the woman of 1850 managed to get in a word about Jim and his fruitless wait at home, the woman of 1950 answered. "Shall you now be absurd enough to leave the man you love for one you hate?" "Shall we take in a show?" he suggested when they had finished their coffee. "I believe I'd rather walk home." "Why, it's 5 miles." He was somewhat disconcerted by her energy, for he was distinctly let down, in reaction from his day's work and his afternoon's excitement of looking forward to an unusual meeting with her, which had turned out after all to be more than commonly placid. 5 miles, and a heavenly night. The first of spring. Come, brace up. You must be feeling pretty strong. No, she said. I am getting a bit headachy. I want some air, to get out of 4 walls and merge into the darkness, if you know what I mean. You're not going to be sick? He answered concernedly. Oh, no, it's just a touch of spring fever, I imagine. There is a cement path with a sloping concrete breakwater which winds between Lake Michigan on one side and Lincoln Park on the other for a distance of several miles. Here come the people in endless procession from morning until midnight, 2 by 2, male and female, walking slow and talking low, permeated by the souls of children begging life. It is a chamber of Maeterlinck's azure palace of the unborn. Presently, by good luck, Georgia and her lover came upon a bench just as another couple was quitting it, the supply of benches being inadequate to the demands of pleasant evenings in spring. The departing two passed, one around each end of the seat, and walked rapidly, several feet apart, across the strip of lawn and bridle path beyond. They were delayed at the curb by the stream of automobiles and stood out in clear relief against the passing headlights. It was evident they had been quarreling, for the man looked sullen and the woman, half turned away, shrugged her shoulders to what he was saying. Georgia had been watching them. "Too bad," said she. "They're having a row." "Perhaps they're not meant for each other." "Everyone quarrels sometimes," she answered, "meant or not." "Do you think we would if—" "I'm sure of it," she replied sharply. "We're human beings, not angels." There was doubtless common sense in what she said, but nevertheless it delighted him not. He wished that she could in such moments as these yield herself fully to the illusion which possessed him that their life together would be one sempiternal climax of joy. "I honestly believe," he asserted solemnly, "that sometimes two natures are so perfectly adjusted that there is no friction between them." "Rubbish," she replied, quoting a newly read Shaw preface. "People aren't meant to stew in love from the cradle to the grave." She couldn't understand her own mood. She had arranged this evening with Stevens to tell him that she was ready to marry him, and she found herself unable to. Her conscious purpose was the same as ever. Yet, as often as she summoned herself to look the look or keep the silence which would put in train his declaration, it seemed as if she received from her depths a sudden and imperative mandate against it. It was her long silence while she was pondering over these strange things which gave him a false cue, and he entered to the center of her consciousness. "This wasting of ourselves must go on until he dies?" "The only way out is death," she said slowly, "or apostasy." Apostasy! The word had an ugly sound, even for him. "I know one woman who did it for love of a man." "And she is happy?" Georgia did not answer at once. "And she is happy?" he repeated seriously, as if much depended on the question. "Or not?" "She says she is," she answered, "but I don't think so. She doesn't look happy about the eyes, one notices those things. She seemed changed and reckless and she's not always been faithful to her husband. I found it out." "You found it out?" "Yes. She asked me to go to a dinner party. Her husband was away from town. There were 4 of us, and I could tell what it meant. She wanted me to do what she was doing, and we had been friends for so long we took our first communion together." "Georgia," he asked, chilled through with fright, "do you often have that sort of thing put in your way?" "I have plenty of chances to make a mess of life," she replied. "Every woman does, who's passable looking, especially downtown women." "Dearest heart," he begged. "I can't go on thinking of that the rest of my life. Marry me and let me shield and shelter you from all this." "This what?" "Temptation," he blurted, "and rotten, unwomanly downtown life. A woman ought to be taken care of, in her own home, by the man who loves her and respects and honors her." Georgia smiled. "Do you know," she asked, "that's almost exactly, word for word, the way he talked to this friend of mine and persuaded her to get her divorce and leave the church and marry him. Almost word for word. She told me about it at the time. And now she's fooling him. It didn't shield her from temptation." "But I have known people to be divorced and marry again and live perfectly happy and respectable lives." "Protestants, weren't they?" she asked. "Yes." "Ah, that's the point. They do what they think is right, but a Catholic does what she knows is wrong, and begins her new marriage in a willful sin. So what can grow from it but more sin?" Her voice, naturally full and resonant like a trained speaker's, was thin and uncertain as she told of the apostate. Her other self, the woman of the past, was ascendant, but she fought against what she conceived to be a momentary weakness, and forced her resolution as a skillful rider forces an unwilling horse over a jump. "But if you want me," she said in words that trembled, "you can have me." "If I want you!" He took her in his arms and kissed her. It seemed to her definitely in that instant that nothing could ever be quite the same with her again, that a certain fine purity had passed from her forever, and she must live thereafter on a lower plane. All the modernistic teachings, books, lectures, pamphlets with which she had in recent years packed her head, on woman's right to selfhood, parasitic females, prostitution in marriage, endowed motherhood, sexual slavery, and all the practical philosophy of the success school which she had learned from years of contact with money makers, that life is more for the daring than for the good, were washed away by the earlier formed and deeper lying impressions of her youth. She was aware of a fleeting return of her virginal feeling that to give herself to one man was humbleness sufficient for a lifetime, but to give herself to two would be the permanent lowering of pride. But she felt that for her the moving finger had writ and passed. There could be no more going back or shadow of turning. Henceforth, for good or evil, she belonged to this man. She yielded to his kisses, as many as he wished, in passive submission. "You will always be good to me. Promise me that. Promise me, dear," she begged. "Because if you're not, I'll—" Her voice choked, and 2 tears rolled down her cheeks. Gone was her freedom and her pride. She spoke, not as her ideal had been, partner speaking to partner on even terms, but as a servant to her master, asking not justice, but mercy. Her solitary happiness in this hour was the feeling that the man was the stronger, that despite his greenness and awkwardness and the ease with which she had hitherto controlled him, fundamentally his nature was bigger than hers, and that she was compelled to follow him. In her new feebleness she rejoiced that she sinned not boldly and resolutely, but because she had been taken in the traditional manner by the overpowering male. "I have been looking forward to this for longer than you suspect," said she, "and now that it's come I feel as if I were at a play watching it happen to someone else." He put his hand on her shoulder, then quickly turned her white face to his. "Why, what is the matter?" he asked. "You are shaking like a leaf." "I think I'd better go home. It is damp and cold sitting here." After they had gone a few steps, she said, with a weak little laugh, "I've lost my enthusiasm for walking. Put me on the car." He began to be thoroughly frightened. "Don't worry, dear," she reassured him. "Nothing can change us now. We belong to each other. For keeps." They said little to each other in the brightly lighted street car. She sat slightly crumpled, her shoulders rounded, swaying to the stops and starts. She breathed slowly through her lips, and her eyes had the strange wide-open look of a young bird's when you hold it in your hands. And he, but partly understanding, yearned for her helplessly, and covenanted with his nameless gods that no sorrow should ever come to her from him. She hung to his arm as they walked up the half-lighted street where she lived, between rows of 3, 4, and 5-story flat buildings full of drama. Outside her own, she stopped and looked up to her windows. They were brightly lighted. Instead of using her key, she rang the bell to her apartment. She heard Al's voice in answer. "Is Jim there?" she asked. "Yes." She turned to Stevens with a flash of her old positiveness. "I must go somewhere else, and I don't feel like telling my troubles to any friend to night, so will you take me to a hotel?" They returned to the car line by an unusual street, lest Al should come looking after her, she driving her sick frame along by sheer will, her lover resolved that if need be he would save her from herself. She waited while he engaged her room, and when he came bringing her key, he said, "I have put you down as Miss Talbot." "Oh, you were nice to think of that. I like to imagine sometimes it still is so." She took his hand. "Good night, dear," she whispered. "I will be a true wife to you." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Rebellion by Joseph M. Patterson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Stevens called up Georgia's room in the morning to ask how she had slept, and she reported, "Well, that is, pretty well," which wasn't true, for she had tossed wretchedly through the night. By carefully brushing and buying a shirtwaist, she managed to measurably freshen her appearance, though she reached the office with tired eyes and hectic splotches beneath her eyes. Al was there before her, waiting with white face. "Georgia," he began miserably, "I've been hunting the town for you. Where have you been?" "Alone." "You've frightened us half to death. Mother's sick over it." "You can have Jim in the house or me, but not both of us." She would give him no more satisfaction, and he was turning away angry at her obstinacy when Mason came up to greet her. "Good morning." "Good morning." Al quickly divined that here was the man. It was written in the way he looked at her, and in Georgia's sudden sidelong glance at Al to see if he saw. "I'd like a word with you," said the brother to the lover, tapping him on the shoulder with studied rudeness. "Now." Stevens didn't understand the situation, but he was properly resentful, and lowered at the stranger. In these subtle days of commerce, finger tips on collar bones may convey all that was once meant by a glove in the face. "My brother, Mr. Stevens," she explained. They did not shake hands. Mason was not quite sure from the young fellow's expression just what might happen, but he was sure it had better not happen right there. "Let's get out of the office, and you can have as many words as you want," said he. Georgia arose to go with them. "No, don't you come," said Stevens. "I think perhaps it would be better." "But it wouldn't. You stay here," the man answered with great positiveness. She sank obediently in the chair, to the disgusted amazement of her brother, and let them go alone. "Were you out with her last night?" "Yes." The lad sunk his hand to his coat pocket, his wild young brain aflame with violence and romance and vengeance and the memory of Moxey's sweetheart's uncle who had slain the despoiler of his home. Stevens was near death as he knew it, but he never batted an eye as Al reported later to Moxey. "I knew it damned well. She said she was alone." His hand tightened on the automatic, pressing down the safety lock, and he pointed the gun so that he could shoot through his pocket and kill. "She was, after 11. I left her then." "Prove it. You've got to," insultingly. "Go look at the hotel register for the name of Miss Georgia Talbot." Al grunted. Here was a concrete fact, subject to verification, yes or no. "All right," he vouchsafed curtly, "if it turns out that way. But one more thing. Keep away from her after this altogether. Understand?" Al shot out his jaw and swung around his pocket with the barrel pointing straight at Stevens' middle. He looked just then a good deal like a young tough delivering a serious threat, which he was. Stevens shoved his derby hat back and laughed. "If you think you can run me around with the pop gun, guess again. I'm going to marry Georgia, and you're coming to the wedding." He stepped right up to the gun and tapped Al sharply on the shoulder. "Understand?" It was perhaps a chancy thing to do, for the lad had worked himself into a state of self-righteous anger, and his vanity was savagely exalted by the sensation of putting it over on a full-grown man to his face. But Stevens had acted instinctively, as he frequently did in stressful moment, and his instinct played him true this time. "She ain't allowed to marry again, so you keep off the grass," he answered loudly. But his voice broke and shot up an octave as he took his hand from his pocket to clench his fist and shake it in the other's face. Whereat Stevens knew he had him and answered quietly in his most matter-of-fact business tones, "That's for her to say, and she's said it." He smiled. "You know she's free, white and 21." Al, not sure just what his next step ought to be, walked away, probably to consult with Moxey, muttering as he went, "Well, remember I warned you." Stevens returned to the office and explained the incident briefly to Georgia. "Oh, the kid was excited at first, but I reassured him." While they were talking, the old man rang her buzzer and asked her to have Mr. Stevens come in. A dark, heavy-browed, much-dressed gentleman was in the old man's office, introduced to Mason as Mr. Silverman. Mr. Silverman deserves a paragraph or two. He was said to be a Polish, a Russian, or a Spanish Jew. But nobody knew for sure or dared ask him, for he didn't like it. At 16 or thereabouts he came to the company as an office boy, and in 2 months was indispensable. At 37, owing partly to the conscientious performance of his duties and more to his earnestness in pulling feet from the rungs above him and stamping fingers from the rungs below, he was elected to a position especially created for him, to wit, executive secretary to the president of the Eastern Life Insurance Company of New York, which gave him everything to say about the running of it except the very last word. Perhaps once a quarter he was reversed, and always on some extremely important matter involving the investment of funds. This galled him beyond measure, but he kept it to himself. At the last annual election he would have presented himself as a candidate for president, or at least for first vice president with power to act, but after sizing up the way the proxies were running for the new directorate he knew that crowd would never stand for him, so he squelched his own boom for the time being, and waited. The title was reconferred for the 15th time upon a charming but delicate plutocrat of the 4th generation of New Yorkers, who was compelled to spend his term health hunting in European spas, where Mr. Silverman took delight in sending him for decision a copious stream of unimportant but vexatiously technical questions, which must have disturbed the invalid's serenity, for he had entered the company at the top, and didn't know detail. Mr. Silverman himself settled the more important matters, as there wasn't time to send to Europe and wait for an answer. Whenever he reached for a stronger hold, he had an incontrovertible excuse, and he got to know Mr. Morgan personally. He was stocky, with ample room for his digestion, and like most fighting men, he had a good thick neck that carried plenty of blood to his head. His unpleasantest trait was his shame of race, and his most agreeable one an understanding love of music. His only exercise was strong black cigars, and everyone on the company's payroll dreaded his seemingly preternatural knowledge of what was going on. "Mr. Stevens," said he, "sit down. I have heard of you." Then, to allow that pregnant remark to sink in, he turned to Georgia. "Take this, please. Mr. W. F. Plaisted, General Agent in Charge, S.W. Division, Eastern Life Insurance Company, Kansas City, Missouri. Dear Sir: Please furnish the bearer, Mr. Mason Stevens, with whatever information he desires. He is my personal representative. With kind regards, yours truly, Executive Secretary to the President. That is all. He nodded to Georgia, and she departed. The old man pussy-footed after her, leaving the other two together in his private office. You are to take the 9 o'clock train tonight for Kansas City to prepare a report for me on why we aren't getting more business in the town and our competitors less. Here are some letters from New York to certain banks there which will admit you to their confidence. Find out all you can about Plaisted and his office before you go to him. Send me a night letter to my hotel every night as to your progress. Use this code. He took a typewritten sheet of synonyms from his pocket. Should you cross the trail of another investigator for the Eastern, you are not to reveal yourself to him. This point you are to bear in mind. He paused for an answer. Yes, sir, said Stevens. Your expense money will be liberal, and mind, no talk, not even a hint to your best girl. I suppose, of course, there is one. Mason smiled, but did not answer. I am told you are not married. No, sir. Perhaps it is just as well. Women are to live with, not to travel with, and you're still traveling. Mr. Silverman lit a 50-center, and then, being a natural-born commander, topped off his instructions with hopes of loot. Good luck, young man. You're shaking hands with your future on this trip. Mason came from the interview consecrated to the task of getting the goods on Plaisted. Going after him was like going after ivory in Africa. Landing a prospect was as tame relatively as plugging ducks on the Illinois River. For Plaisted had been a big man in the company in his day, though getting a little old now. With solid connections through Missouri, Kansas and the Southwest, if he fell, he'd fall with a smash. Mason rather fancied that in company politics he could see as far through a grindstone as his neighbor, if it had a hole in it. He knew that there was a hidden but bitter fight for control of the business between the old New York society crowd who had inherited it and the younger, abler men under the leadership of Silverman, who had grown up from the ranks. He knew that his own boss, the old man, lined up with Silverman, but that Plaisted had delivered the southwestern proxies in a solid block, for the New York ticket. He therefore inferred that Mr. Silverman didn't feel strong enough to remove Plaisted without a pretty plausible reason, and that he was being sent to Kansas City to find the reason. And failing that, to make one, which, as it turned out, was precisely what he did. He set out on his mission with as little compunction as a soldier who had received orders to shoot to kill. For, as he told himself, surely Plaisted had also pulled down men in his time. Life is a battle. Therefore, is it not well to be with the conqueror and share in the cut? If he could now make good with Silverman, and, more especially, convince him that he was a live one who would keep on making good, the Jew would certainly recognize him in the reorganization. He had visions of tooling along the macadam in his Pano 6 to a vined house in the suburbs, hidden by tall trees, where, in a trailing gown, Georgia would walk through her flowers to meet him, with a small hand clinging to each of hers. Plaisted had now become, to all intents and purposes, his competitor. And going after your competitors is the life of trade. As for Mrs. Plaisted, if there was one, who was she against Georgia? End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Rebellion by Joseph M. Patterson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. He expected to be gone several weeks, so Georgia telephoned the janitor to tell Mama that she would stay down for dinner, again, but would be home soon afterwards. Mason took her to the top of a tall building, where there was a 60-cent table d'hôte. The topic, of course, was his forthcoming trip from routine to adventure and its probable effect upon their fortunes. For all the wise saws about not talking to women, one may hardly dine with his fiancée of a day without mention of the marvelous opportunity which dropped before one that morning as from the skies, especially if she is in the same business and heard it drop. So, little by little, one thing leading to another, he told her everything he knew or guessed or hoped. He did not once forget Silverman's injunction to silence, as he babbled on. It stuck in his mind like a thorn in the foot, and, telling himself he was a fool to talk, he talked. The precise moment didn't seem to come when he could frankly say, without offense, "Georgia, that part of it is a secret." And he didn't see how to temporize widely, for it had become physically impossible for him to lie to her, though, of course, he retained the use of his faculties for commerce with others. So he passed on the ever heavy load of silence, hoping that she could hold her tongue if he couldn't. It was as much her affair as his anyway, so he felt, and if by her indiscretion she should cut him out of Silverman's confidence and future big things, she would in the same motion cut herself out of a Pano 6 and a house in the trees and a richer circle of friends. But, inasmuch as she was a case-hardened private secretary, she kept her faith with him in this thing at least. If he never had a Pano 6, it wasn't her fault. The most surprising thing to her in his narrative was that it did not greatly interest her. It seemed to her a far-off affair, impersonal, like something she was reading in the papers. Stevens seemed to stand outside her area of life, which had become narrow and curiously uneasy, heavy with a future in which he was not concerned. At first he attributed the listlessness, which she tried to conceal but could not, to one of the widely advertised feminine moods, and he tried his best to divert her, not merely with pictures of their future, blissful and automobileful, but also with quips and cranks and wanton wiles. No go. So when course 6 of the table d'hôte, nuts and pecans, 3 of each to the order, was ended, he suggested that perhaps she would better go directly home instead of waiting downtown with him until his train went. She acquiesced. They walked to the L in silence. Imagine the chagrin of a knight riding off to the bloody wars from a lady who didn't care if he never came back. That was how it struck him. She took his arm to climb the steep iron stairs, and at the top stopped a moment to get her breath. "Dear heart," she said, "don't have all those awful thoughts about me. Don't you suppose I know what you're thinking? I've been dull to night, but my head is simply splitting. I believe I'm in for the grip." He looked at his watch. "I'm sure I can take you home and get back in time." "Rather than have you risk it, I'll stay down until your train goes." "Promise me then to get to a doctor and go right to bed." "I'll go right to bed. I can barely hold my head up, and I'll get a doctor in the morning if I'm not better." There were only 2 or 3 other people on the long platform, so he kissed her good by. Then the screened iron gate was slapped to behind her. The guard jerked his cord, she smiled weakly, and waved her hand back at him, and it was all over for a much longer time than he had any idea of. He watched her train until the tail lights turned the loop, then said "Hell," lit a cigar, pushed his hat back, sighed, and went to check his trunk. He sat up in the smoking compartment gassing with drummers until the last of them turned in, sympathized for a while with the Pullman porter, who suffered volubly as soon as Mason gave him permission to. He had been married that very afternoon, and now he was off to Los Angeles and back, a 10-day journey, leaving behind him as a dark and shining mark for those who realized the devilishness of his itinerary, an unprotected, young, gay-hearted bride. He appreciated the snares that would be set for her by his brothers of brush and birth. He'd been a bachelor himself. "Yes, sah. Railroadin' is sure one yella dog's life for a fambly man." Stevens lay awake a long time that night thinking of the future, and Georgia lay awake a long time considering the past. She felt hot and thirsty. 3 or 4 times she got out of bed and ran the faucet until the water was cold and bathed her face and drank. After she had left Stevens, she had taken a cross seat in the car facing homeward, and, placing her burning cheek against the window for coolness, had dozed off for many stations. When she awoke with a start at the one beyond her own, her personality had slipped to its earlier center as definitely as when a clutch slips from high to second speed. It is said that the last step gained by the individual or the race is the first step lost, in sickness, age, and fear. So Georgia's illness began its attack on the topmost layer of her character, that part of it which had been built in the recent years. She was driven, as it were, to a lower floor of her own edifice and no longer saw so wide a view. Her pride and self-will crumbled, for the sick aren't proud, and her modernity trickled away. After all, was it not more peaceful to do what people thought you ought to, than to fight them constantly for your own way? Life was too short, and human nature too weak, for the stress and strain of such ceaseless resistance as she had made in the past few years against her family, the friends of her family, and the church. For God's sake, let her now have peace. Yes, for God's sake. The words had come irreverently to her mind. But, after all, could she or anyone else have peace except from God? And was there any other gift as sweet? She knew there was one sure anodyne for her troubled spirit, and only one, the confessional. She had kept away too long already, for more than 2 years. She would go tomorrow, or perhaps the next day, and wash her soul clean. Father Hervey would talk to her as if to rip her heartstrings out, but in the end he would leave her with peace, after she had promised and vowed to give up her mortal sin. Poor Mason, that meant him. She wept a few weak tears, then dried her eyes on the corner of the sheet. So this was to be the end of her spiritual adventuring, the end of the free expression of her free being, and selfhood, and all those other valorous things she had rejoiced in. She wasn't able any longer to go on with it. She must desert the army of women in the day of battle, the army led by Curie, Key, Pankhurst, Schreiner, Adams, Gilman, and cross over to the adversary, the encompassing church. It would absorb her into its vast unity as a drop disappears in the sea. It would think for her and will for her. She would be animated with its life, and not her own. But it would suffice her with the comfort that is past understanding. She would eat the lotus and submit. She was not strong, like great people. Perhaps the priest would suggest her return to Jim. But that wasn't in the law. He could only suggest and urge it. He could not insist on it. She couldn't go back to Jim. She couldn't. She couldn't. She sobbed as if there were a presence in the room which she hoped to move by her tears. A clear vision of her husband came before her, as she had often seen him, sitting on the edge of this very bed, in undershirt and trousers, leaning forward, breathing abominably loud, his paunch sagging, unlacing his shoes. Right or wrong, good or bad, heaven or hell, that was one sight the priest should never make her see again. She hated Jim, and loathed him forever. As she was dressing next morning, she called to Al to please go down and telephone for the doctor, for she knew she could never go through the day's work without medicine. Presently Dr. Randall bowled up, a jolly, stout man, smiling gaily and crinkling up the corners of his eyes, though he had slept just 8 hours in the last 72. The family was glumly finishing breakfast when he came. Throughout the meal Mrs. Talbot had been burningly aware of the contrast between decent, self-respecting women with a thought to themselves, and brazen young fly-by-nights in thin waists who run after men and make themselves free. But she threw only a few pertinent remarks into the atmosphere, because the poor girl was so evidently out of sorts, with her high color and not touching a bite of food. Indeed, a body could hardly help feeling sorry for her, for all her wicked pride of will. Very likely this sickness was a judgment on her for it. When Dr. Randall had considered her pulse, her temperature and her tongue, and asked half a dozen questions, he told Al to send for a carriage and take her immediately to Columbus Hospital. "Why, doctor," exclaimed Mrs. Talbot, terrorized, "is it anything serious?" "Typhoid. I'll telephone to let 'em know you're coming." The doctor departed, and Mrs. Talbot took Georgia on her lap and crooned over her until the carriage came. Chapter 17